Hi, welcome back. Brian here again. Today we're going to be taking another look at the soldiers of the Virginia Company of London. If you caught our earlier, very early video on the soldiers of the Virginia Company, we looked specifically at private soldiers, at the regular guys, which are the bulk of the people here. But today we're going to take a little bit closer look at the officers in general, and somewhat more specifically the sergeants. It should be noted in this time period there's really no such thing as a non-commissioned officer. You're either a soldier or an officer or a gentleman adventurer. Private entities attached to companies that may or may not be involved in the chain of command, or may or may not be required to participate in whatever's going on. They tend to muddy the waters a bit. But for today, we're looking at the structure. Corporals, sergeants, lieutenants, ensigns, captains, they're all officers. If you're not a private soldier, you're an officer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the passage from the Laws Divine, Morall and Martiall that we are discussing today. It is also required that the governor never lie out of his town or fort, whereby he may the better keep good espial upon all officers, that they perform their several duties, each one in his place, especially in good observatio of the watch and guard, for the more confident securing the charge committed to him. He shall not suffer in his garrison any soldier to enter into guard, or to be drawn out into the field, without being armed according to the marshal's order, which is that every shot shall either be furnished with a quilted coat of canvas, a headpiece and a sword, or else with a light armor and bases quilted, with which he shall be furnished, and every targetier with his bases to the small of his leg, and his headpiece, sword, and pistol, or scuppet provided for that end. And likewise every officer armed as before with a firelock or snap-haunce, headpiece, and a target. Only the sergeant in garrison shall use his halberd, and in the field his snap-haunce and target. It's not a great long passage. We've got the archaeological evidence that shows us the great variety of weapons and armor that come into the colony. We've got a lot of passing mentions and written descriptions that talk about the great variety of weapons and armor in the colony. We don't have a whole lot that actually specifies the expectation of how each man should be equipped. Plenty of expectations for duties, and that sort of thing. But this fairly brief passage is really the only spot, especially anywhere official in the laws and orders, the only spot that specifically lays out at least a bare minimum expectation of this. This is at least what each man should be doing. And to break this down, it starts by talking about the governor, that the governor should basically be where he's supposed to be, in the place that he's in charge of, and keeping a close eye on everything. And in this case, they're not necessarily talking about the captain general, lord governor, top administrator of the colony. By the time these laws were written, by 1610, 1611, there are multiple fortifications, multiple outposts spread throughout Tidewater, Virginia. And the officer in command of each of those garrisons is often going to be referred to as the governor. He is governing that particular spot. So this is not necessarily, again, talking about Lord Delaware or whichever governor or lieutenant governor is administrating the colony at that moment. These are garrison commanders. And so it makes a little bit more sense that they shouldn't be spending a lot of time out away from the place that they're supposed to be running. And they're supposed to be keeping a close eye on things, and one of the things they're supposed to be keeping an eye on is making sure that none of the soldiers in his garrison are going to work without the approved equipment. Right? And so they don't want them entering into guard or being drawn out into the field. They don't want them standing around on guard duty each day or going into combat without the prescribed equipment. And it says, according to the marshal's order, The Marshal in this instance is going to be Sir Thomas Dale, which, of course, if you're not familiar with Sir Thomas Dale, one of our more recent videos, you can learn about Sir Thomas Dale. But he's the one who has, prescribed essentially how these guys are to be equipped. And again, we see a variety with the regular soldiers. A quilted coat of canvas and a headpiece, or a light armor, which is almost certainly a pikeman's corselet, would be one of the most common infantry armors available at the time. They talk about bases quilted. It seems it is a less common arrangement, a very non-standard arrangement of defensive equipment compared to what would be typical in Europe. We assume breastplate, backplate, and tassets or skirts essentially attached to that armor, made of the quilted armor. We know they're also using whole quilted armor, but again, there's some assumption that has to be made there. Obviously, there's no archaeological evidence for quilted armor, so we have to go by the written descriptions, which are not always as specific and detailed as we would like. Same thing for the targetier. Bases to the small of his leg. What's the small of your leg? There's a couple of different things that could potentially mean. So again, talking about how they should be equipped there with the variety of equipment that we already know is in use in the colony. And then for that targetier, he's got his target, his shield, and then the sword and pistol or scuppet, another compact firearm that could be kind of used interchangeably with a pistol. And then we get to the officers. It says, and likewise, every officer armed as before with a firelock or snap-haunce. The English seem to be using the term snap-haunce in a lot of written records at that time as a catch-all for anything that we today might classify as some sort of flintlock operation. So not just the one very specific operating system that we today term the snap-haunce, but Mechalite locks, and they found a Roman lock pistol down a well on the island. It's anything that strikes flint and steel together to generate its spark. The English seem to be using the term snap-haunce often as a catch-all. So firelock or snap-haunce, probably referring to wheel locks with the term firelock. Again, hard to be sure. Firelock is in itself a very broad scope term. It makes its own fire. It's a firelock, right? But again, they're saying we're not bothered all that much about what kind of pistol you've got. Just have one, right? And so they talk about again, every officer armed as before with a firelock, snap-haunce, headpiece, and a target. Only the sergeant in garrison shall use his halberd, and in the field his snap-haunce and target. So in combat in the field, the officers are basically, they're armed like targetiers. The sergeant is the one who gets something specific, the one that they're calling out individually. In garrison, he's got to be carrying around his halberd. It's a visual cue. Everybody around, immediately they're going to know, oh, there's the sergeant. He's kind of that front line of troop management, especially in garrison. At home, the officers do not necessarily have to be involved in the higher ranking officers do not necessarily have to be involved in the minute-to-minute ordering of the soldiers' days. The sergeant and corporals are managing that. Well, the corporals are in all likelihood armed in the same manner as the men that they're working with, and so the sergeant is, again, specified he should be carrying his halberd when in garrison, but they're still acknowledging in the field against the Powhatan, who don't have heavy infantry, don't have cavalry, the polearm is not as applicable. Carrying a shield for the deflection of arrows, useful thing, and again, emphasizing firearms. They want every one of those targetiers, every officer to be carrying some kind of firearm. Really heavy emphasis on the firearms in service in Virginia. You would not necessarily see a targetier equipped for service on the battlefields of Europe carrying a pistol. Not that there's necessarily any hard and fast rule that says he shouldn't, but it would not necessarily have been as normal an expectation. But here, everybody better be carrying some kind of firearm. So again, not a tremendously detailed account. This is about the most thorough that they ever really get. Make sure they're all wearing armor. Make sure, the musketeers are equipped as they should be, the targetiers are equipped as they should be, and the officers are equipped as targetiers in the field. And in the garrison, sergeant carrying his halberd. So, hopefully this has answered questions that some of you may have had. If you have any additional questions, let us know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we will catch you next time.